And welcome to Den Bahamians. Talking with Mara Laureano, and she is the manager of the Milstein Division of the U.S. History and Local History and Genealogy here at the New York Public Library at 42nd Street. Welcome, Mara.
Thank you,
Mara.
Pearl. Nice
Okay, it's
here.
a pleasure. You know, I first became interested in genealogy when my brother always asked me, when are you going to get together and let's talk about the family? And I said, okay, I'll do that. And out of that came, you know, that we own a lot of land in the Caribbean. Mm-hmm. And so in order to take ownership of it, we had to do a genealogy.
Oh, wow.
Showing our linkage to the original owner. But recently, about a few months ago, we did a Bahamas Genealogical and Heritage Conference and workshop at the Schomburg here in Harlem. And out of that conference came a lot of interest and a desire to know more. And from what I gathered is that people want to know more about themselves. And I thought that, you know, I've done a lot of research at the New York Public Library, and having, you know, talked with you on and off about genealogy, I think that, you know, you're the best person.
Well, thank you, Pearl.
To give us some information on this. And this is just the beginning of a series of genealogical talks that we're going to be having, because I think the interest is there. You know, I started about 10 years ago, and I've seen it grown tremendously. You know, and I'd like for you to tell my audience, how do they get started in genealogy?
Sure. Mm-hmm. Well, at the New York Public Library, we do get a lot of people coming in asking that very question, how do you get started? And our class, we teach classes. And we have a basic introduction class that's probably our most popular class, because there are a lot of people who are interested in their family history, and they don't know quite how to get started, and they don't know exactly beyond maybe having some basic information. They don't know how to take it to the next level. Mm-hmm. So I think going to the library is a really good place to start, and I think you can go to any branch of your public library. Because even if the librarians there don't necessarily know much about genealogy, although more and more librarians are getting informed, there's always going to be books that you can check out that are real basic guides, and that's always a good place to start. But today, I'll try to give everyone sort of the basics, and it's what I tell people when they walk into the library, and if I'm on the reference desk, this is what I tell them. Mm-hmm. And I always tell them they have to start with themselves, which in some ways can be disappointing because people kind of want to start digging into the research. But it's really important that you start with yourself, and more importantly, you start with your family. Mm-hmm. And you do that by making note or writing down everything you know already about your family. And so you kind of interview yourself, or you start taking notes. But then it gets a lot more interesting when you start to interview other members of your family, and you start asking them questions. And it's very important to ask not just yes and no types of questions, but really get them to start telling you details about your immediate family, but also family members that have passed away. And you want to get those stories. But you also want to get the facts. So it's really important to start interviewing family members, and especially the older members of your family or the more fragile members of your family. You want to make sure to get to them first. It's really important. A lot of times people start this process and they realize that they just missed out on talking to a great aunt who passed away last year, and you don't want that to happen. And what's wonderful now, with so much technology available to us, it's very easy to record and even videotape your interviews. So if you're able to do that, that can be really helpful, because that becomes a part of the documentation that you start to accumulate. And it's something that you can then share with other members of your family and have them react to it. But also, you can then come back to it if you don't remember certain pieces. Because some parts of what you're your family members are going to tell you maybe don't have a lot of meaning at the time that you're hearing it, but later on that might be a clue to something. It might solve a mystery later on down the road.
Right.
Then what's also very important is not just taking everyone's word. Not that anyone's trying to lie to you, but people don't always remember things 100%. So if there are documents that your family has in their possession, whether you have it or your mom or your dad, your grandparents, you want to start looking for all those documents. And we're going to talk more about that in a minute.
Okay.
Lastly, I think documenting your findings is really important, and making sure that you're either writing down, things that you're hearing. There are lots of family trees and what they call pedigree charts, charts that help you track the information that you need. There's also lots of really good websites that are, or online software that you can buy. And there's a couple that are free, but the ones that you purchase are probably a little bit better and easier to use. They're not that expensive, and so if you really find that you're committing to doing this long term, then I think investing in having a software package is probably worthwhile, and they're about $25.
I think the Latter-day Saints has a chart that I find very helpful, and I've Xeroxed it over and over again, and I find very, very helpful.
Family Search, which I was going to mention later on in our talk, is a really great website, familysearch.org, that has a lot of very helpful tips and also things like charts that you can download for free.
Right. Yeah. You talk about talking to elderly, the older, these are fragile members in the family. I find that they have a lot of information, but they would say, I don't want to open, or just opening up a can of worms. But I find that opening up a can of worms releases them of that burden. And you find that today it doesn't matter what happened 20, 50 years ago, even what happened 10 years ago, because that's the way things were at that time. And they couldn't change it, and we're not going to change it today, but it's good information to know all of those things that happen, whether it's good or bad. It helps to make you an even better person.
And it's why oftentimes when people start interviewing their elder members of their family, they'll discover things about their family that they never knew. And it was because that information was maybe not something that the family felt comfortable. It wasn't a positive thing, maybe. It was maybe something the family may have gone through some difficult times. And people, once that difficult time has passed, people like to kind of forget about it and not relive it. So they don't talk about it. And hopefully when they're older, they're more willing to open up about that and talk about it. But some people may not. And I guess you can't push it.
Right. Well, also you find that a lot of immigrants coming to this country way back 100 years or longer, they never talk to their members, their family members, about where they're from, their who they left behind. So what I'm encountering now is that there are children of those persons who never talked about their family members back in the Bahamas or back in Puerto Rico or elsewhere, about those families. So they want, and now they're having their children, and they want to know, oh, I heard I'm from Bahamas, but my family never talk about it. How can I get to know more? Someone said they're from Andros, or they're from Cat Island, or they're from Eleuthera. How do I begin?
So we talked about the very, very first step that you took, which is really kind of digging through your own sort of internal attic and finding what you can. But then the basic steps, when you're actually interviewing people and when you're asking yourself those questions, there's some basic steps that people should follow. The first step is defining your goals. I think people can get overly ambitious and get so excited that I think they might take on more than they can chew. So I always tell people that when you're new to genealogy especially, that you should start with maybe one side of your family.
Very true. Mm-hmm.
And even maybe more specific than that, sort of, you've got two parents, but then, you say you decide to pick mom.
Right.
And then, very quickly it starts to get bigger because then your mom has got, she's got a mom and a dad. So are you going to follow your grandfather's side or your grandmother? And so making those decisions, I think, is really important early on. And I think it makes sense to start with the family that maybe you know the most about, because it's going to be easier. And not that it'll be super easy, but it'll be a little easier. It's also, one could argue that you go with the one that really interests you, the line of the family that maybe you really want to learn more about, and that might motivate you or get you through the hard times when it's not going so smoothly. But once you've kind of decided sort of which direction you want to go in, then I always stress to people, it's the who, where, and when. So then this is when it gets down to really being very factual about the research that you do, even though other parts are also going to be very important, like the stories and even just things in your family, like, what foods did you eat? How did you celebrate holidays? All those things are going to be clues to your ancestry. But you really, and to do this research, and to do it well, you have to get down to some basic facts. And it's the who, the where, and the when. And the who is the person, and it's their name primarily. I mean, other parts of them is important too, but the name is critical because that's how you're going to find supporting documentation. The first name, the middle name, the last name. If it's a woman, obviously her maiden name is very important. Nicknames can be important. Not just the name of the person that you're researching, let's say grandma, but also grandma's siblings. The names, if you can find out who their brothers, her brother and sisters were, if she had any. Obviously the name of her parents, if that's known. As many names as you can find is really, really helpful in your research. And finding out not just the middle initial, but if you can find out exactly what that middle name was is also important. The where is where your ancestor lived, and more specifically, the where major things happened to that person. So where was she born? Where was your grandmother born? Exactly, as specific as a location as you can get. So a town would be very useful. Then later on, where did she grow up? Where did she get married? If she immigrated, when did she come to the U.S.? And ultimately leading up to if she's passed away, where did she die? And very closely to the where, and I was even mixing it up myself, is the when. So along with the places, you want to know when these things were happening. So the when is the dates. And as an exact date as possible. So when was somebody born, their exact birth date. When did they get married? When did they immigrate, if they did? When, for instance, even things like when did they go to school, if they went to school, or, just any kind of significant thing that happened to that person. They moved around, if you know dates of when people moved around to different places. And ultimately, if they've passed away, when they died. And
one of the things you said, like, for instance, where, for instance, someone who lived here in New York City in the 1940s, like someone said that they lived here in the 1940s, you now have a directory. A telephone directly. I don't want to, skip. But I find that I've done some research at the Latter-day Saints and the Jewish Center, and a lot of the Jewish Family History Center on 16th Street.
The Center for Jewish History.
Right, Center for Jewish History. Yeah, a lot of the visitors come in there, and they would ask, I heard someone they told me they lived here in New York City, but we don't know actually where. And they're not aware of that new system that I found at the library, at the New York Public Library, the directory.
Well, directories are fascinating because unlike a lot of other records, they get produced more often. So when you think about it, and maybe less so now because telephone directories are sort of on their way out, but telephone directories have been around for many, many years and are published annually.
Right.
But before there were telephone directories, lots of places had what was known as either city directory or residential directories. And for instance, in New York City, the earliest city directory is 1785 or 86. So that's going way back. And what they typically listed were people who were heads of households. So a lot of men were listed in these city directories, but as time went on, you're going to find other people listed in directories. So for instance, I think what you're referring to is we digitized the 1940 telephone directory for New York City. And that project, which is actually available for free on the web, is not just the digitized version of the phone books, although that is available on this free website, which is called Direct Me NYC. It was used as a tool to help people use the 1940 census, which got released in April.
Right.
So to back up a little bit, so directories of all kinds, whether they're white pages or city directories or business directories, directories of people involved in particular professional associations. There's all kinds of directories, and directories can be useful. Because it gives you information about that person in a very specific year.
Right.
Where a lot of records kind of are more spread out. But there are lots of records that you can use, and some are easier to access, and some have more information and are better than others. But ultimately, depending on the question that you're trying to answer, there is a variety of records to use. And that's what makes genealogy really fun, because it's following the paper trail of your ancestors and whatever they happen to have left behind and survived.
Right.
And that's, and some of that paper trail, may only exist in one place. But more and more, we're so lucky that things are being digitized and that we have much easier access to a variety of records today than you did even, 10 years ago, or definitely a lot more than we had 20 years ago.
Right.
So when you're researching, you want to work, like before I was saying about, identifying which way you want to go and kind of defining your goals.
Right.
But then you work backwards, because you start with the body of information that you know is pretty factual, and then you see what's missing, and then you start filling in the missing pieces. And every time you do that, it helps you go back. And you want to make sure that you're working in the right order, because if you start jumping around too much, you might lose the connections. And you want to make sure that your connections stay verified. Because what people, I think, when they start doing this research, they start to realize that there's a lot of people that have similar or the same exact name, born the same year, the same town as your ancestor, and they may not even be related. So sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not. So you really want to make sure you're following the right lead. And there's some records that are very good because they have a lot of information in them. So the ones that genealogists call like the bare bones of genealogy are what known as vital records. So that would be your birth certificate or your marriage certificate. Death records are also very good. But they are not always the easiest records to get a hold of.
Right, yes.
Because there's a lot of privacy restrictions with those, especially for the last, every place is going to have a different law about this, but, probably for the first half of the 20th century, a lot of those records may not be open.
Right, yeah. 50 years, then I think death records.
For death and marriages in New York.
Birth, forget it.
Go back to 1909. And then every state in the United States has a different law that governs access to vital records. A lot of it's not online.
Right.
So a lot of it you do have to visit the location, and this is also true for other countries and not just the U.S. You know, so when you start when you start looking for some of these things, you start realizing that some of the obstacles you have in the U.S. are going to be the same obstacles you're going to find when you go to to the Bahamas or to Italy, or it's very similar kinds of situations.
Yeah.
Luckily, in the U.S., we do have the census records, and those tend to be the records that people use the most. They're probably the most popular records to use, and are used very early on because there's such great access to them. And the census is a federal record, and the federal government started counting or sort of tracking the population as early as 1790.
Right.
And then it's every 10 years. And I'm sure, as people remember, we had a census just in 2010 where we didn't actually answer very many questions. So down the road, our descendants are going to be very upset with us because they're going to have a hard time doing research. But so the census every 10 years, and there is a privacy restriction on those. So it's 72 years. So after 72 years, the National Archives releases those records. And at this point, all of those records have been digitized, and the commercial company known as Ancestry.com, they have indexed all of it, so it makes it searchable by name.
Okay.
And there's other places you can find other years of the census, sometimes for free and sometimes through a paid subscription. Or, of course, I have to stress that you can come to the New York Public Library and you can search it for free. We have Ancestry available on site at the library. But these census records will give you a lot of really good information, and because it's every 10 years, you can kind of follow people through time and kind of learn a little bit about them besides the who, where, when. But other things like their profession, where did they live, who were their neighbors. Then, of course, the 1940 census, which got released in April of this year, asked a lot of questions about employment because it was during the Depression. And the government was very interested in knowing more about people's employment situation. So they asked a lot of questions about that. So that can be kind of interesting, too.
Yeah, great. Wonderful. Now, you mentioned some of the records. My ancestor, from the Loyalist. Do you have records? What's available there at the library on Loyalist?
Well, it's we do have some records. I mean, there's different kinds of for Loyalists. So those during the American Revolution that sided with the British, and then after the Revolutionary War, many of them left the new United States, although some did stay, and moved to places like in the Caribbean, to Canada, and then sometimes they come back to the U.S. So there are books that do list the names of Loyalists. So if you had heard that about your family, or you sort of have an idea that maybe that was true, that might be one place to start. But the library does have a very special collection, and it's actually not online, it's on microfilm, and it's of the Loyalist claims. So when the Loyalists, after the war, and I'm not an expert on this, so you'll have to forgive me, but from what I understand, they would make a claim to the British government for compensation for having served on the losing side. And sometimes I think that would lead to them getting land, possibly.
Very true.
So if they applied for compensation from the British government, they would be a part of this collection that we have on microfilm called the Loyalist claims. And it is indexed by name, so there is the possibility of looking for more details about that. And those papers, those whatever they filled out, would have a lot of details about them. And so it could really, especially if we're talking 18th century, there not a lot of records survive. The paper trail gets a little thin the further back you go. for many reasons. But, one, because maybe not as many were produced, but two, during that time there were lots of fires, floods, and things get destroyed. But it's a great way to learn a lot more about your ancestors. So it's nice that you don't have to travel to London to look at these records, although it's not a bad place to visit. So that's one example of something very specialized.
Okay. Now there's the rare books. Do you have any rare books at the library that will help you in genealogy as well?
It depends how you define rare. In the library world, rare usually means a book that was published a long time ago, that there aren't very many copies, and that's what makes them obviously rare.
Right.
But I would also lump in there, especially for genealogy, something that I think is sort of rare, even though it may not have been published that long ago, are family histories. So for, as long as people have been interested in genealogy, sometimes people get overly, very, very enthusiastic about this work, and they take their documentation to the form of a book.
Okay.
And which is amazing when people take all that research that they've done and package it in a way that it becomes a full-length book. And we have a really large collection of family histories, and some of our family histories are published, in the 18th century, many more later on, but 19th century, 20th century, even just today, actually, I got a gift of a family history.
Okay.
So people are still producing them, and oftentimes this might be the one public copy of a family history. So the family produces, the person doing the research produces the book. They might distribute it to other family members. And then they might distribute it to one or a couple of different libraries, so that possibly other people could find this.
Okay. Let me just take a quick station identification.
Yes, sure.
I want to let the folks know that we're talking to Mara Liriano. She's the manager of the Milstein Division of U.S. History and Local History and Genealogy here at the New York Public Library on 42nd Street. And we're talking about getting started in genealogy. And I hope that, my folks who are listening, that they are enriched and that they are thinking about getting started in genealogy, and we'll be looking to do some research at the New York Public Library. I first started out at the New York Public Library, and I found the staff there very helpful. So I think that you shouldn't hesitate to come into the public library and start, finding out who I am, where did I come from, why am I Catholic, why am I not Episcopalian, why am I Baptist, and also some of the intricacies of, things that family members do, how they bury the dead, how they celebrate birthdays, and different events. So. It's good. It's a good enriching exercise. Yes. Okay. So can we move on to next one?
Yeah, sure.
Next, keeping in sequence. Now you talk about places to do genealogy. You said that all the libraries here in New York City have a little small division of genealogy, or
not necessarily, but they have access to some really good databases, primarily being Ancestry.com, which within libraries it's known as Ancestry Library Edition. And it's the same thing as Ancestry.com, except that unlike the .com version, you can't personalize it. So if you have your own personal subscription, you can then save a lot of the research that you're doing, and you can share it. They have some really nice features. So when you really get into it, it's something that might be worthwhile investing in. But I love being able to tell people that when you're starting off, it's really good that you can come to the library and access it for free. And get all, access to all those records, all those census records, as well as, lots of other things that have been digitized, and they do add to it a lot.
Right.
So that's one very important database that people can access at any branch of the New York Public Library. But there'll be some branches that are going to be they're going to have maybe some additional information or expertise.
Right.
And so, if you go to the Schomburg Center for Black Culture and Studies up in Harlem, or if you go to the Bronx Library Center, some of the bigger branches of the New York Public Library, might have some additional information.
Okay.
But really, if you're able, I do ask that people come down to the main branch on Fifth Avenue and 42nd Street, the Stephen A. Schwartzman building. It's fondly referred to as the building with the lions out front.
Right.
And we're in room 121 on the first floor, and it's the Milstein Division, U.S. History, Local History, Genealogy, and we specialize in genealogy. So we're going to have the most information and the most expertise. So it's really a good place to go and not only get started, but actually people come back to the Milstein Division all the time to do research, and we actually cater to a lot of professional genealogists because we have such a wide variety
Very true.
of information available in one place.
Very true. Yeah.
But there are other really wonderful repositories and other research centers, in New York City. We're really fortunate. And some of these places are going to have records that are not available anywhere else. And the number one location for that would be the city's archive, which is referred to as the Municipal Archive. And they're down on Chambers Street. And they hold the city's old records for many, many of their agencies.
Okay.
And that includes having some of the older vital records, some of those old birth records, marriage records, death records. But they also have lots of other kinds of records that can be useful, especially if you're doing New York City genealogy.
Yeah. What about the classes that you offer at the library? When is your next?
Well, we have we have a variety of classes and also lectures. We bring in experts to kind of talk on very specialized topics, which is really nice. So the classes are kind of ongoing. So the best thing to do is to check out the library's website, nypl.org, because there are classes happening not only in our location, but also in some of the other branches of the library.
Okay.
And the main lecture series that we do, we're very fortunate that we do it jointly with the New York Genealogical and Biographical Society, which is New York's sort of oldest and leading genealogical society. So when you really get into it, you join the New York Genealogical and Biographical Society, because they can give you access to a lot of really specialized information. But we've joined forces with them. They donated their library to the New York Public Library in 2008. And with that, we also now collaborate on many things. And they bring in the experts.
Right.
And we have 3 or 4, I'm losing track now, of these leading genealogists coming in to talk to give us a talk, and it's free. The next one is coming up, is on the New York State Archive.
Okay.
And then we have one about social media in genealogy. So what people are doing in using Facebook and Twitter to do family history research. One that I'm looking forward to will be with Megan Schmoliak she's doing a talk on DNA. In genealogy, which is very, very much a hot topic.
Yes.
And then in December, we're going to have a talk on sort of other places to look for genealogy information that you don't always think of.
Right.
So the less obvious pieces of
secrets.
paper.
Yeah. I think we had someone at the 1940s census, on the road to 1940 census, talking about the secrets.
Yes.
In the census. So there are secrets that one need to uncover when looking for their.
Yeah, and actually what was interesting about that talk is that you get, this was true for me, but you get accustomed to using certain records like the census and looking for certain kinds of information on it. But what this talk emphasized is that there's other information or other way to interpret what you're seeing that can actually be very helpful. And that you really learn all of that through time. And, my favorite thing is to go to these lectures. But I also really enjoy watching a lot of the television programs that are very popular right now on genealogy. And I find that even though it's a 1-hour show and they make it seem really easy and they go all the way back, several generations. But I kind of like that they do expose you to some of the process and they expose you to some of the records that are helpful. And also show that, what you can really get out of doing something like that. So shows like Who Do You Think You Are and the Henry Louis Gates shows on PBS, which are so wonderful, Finding Your Roots, and all the other ones that he's done on PBS. And many of those you can still watch online. And actually, I think a lot of those all of them are watchable for free online.
Beautiful.
And I find that that's a really nice way to learn a little bit about genealogy, but also to keep to kind of keep your interest, to kind of while you're going through the hard times, maybe you can kind of get some inspiration from some of that.
Let's talk about the 1940 census. When they came out in April, there were some parts of it that were missing. How are the census for New York City? Is it complete yet, or?
Yeah, well, it wasn't that it was missing, but what happened, which was different this time around. So, as I mentioned before, they get released after 72 years, and so it was time for the 1940 to get released, and it was exactly 72 years later on April. It was supposed to be April 1st, but April 1st was a Sunday, so they moved it to Monday. The National Archives, they're the keepers of those records. They did something new for and different with the 1940 census, and that's by releasing them online for the very first time. Prior to that, they had released records on microfilm. But this was the first time that it was online and available to anyone to access them. However, the National Archives doesn't have an index to the records. The records, they're arranged geographically. But they had never had an index. And when they released them in April, it didn't come with an index. So there was no way to plug in a name and see what came up. So then from the moment that they got released, then companies like Ancestry.com and organizations like the Latter-day Saints, they actually organized indexing through volunteers, but they all started to index, which means that a person had to go through every single page and write down the name of the person, and other information like their age and who else they were living with and where were they, so that ultimately you could type in a name and pull up everybody that matches that name.
So that process is still ongoing.
Well, actually, Ancestry completed that. Very quickly, much faster than anybody thought they would. So it's fully searchable through that service, and I believe Family Search has either completed it or are very, very close. But I think they also may have completed it. The caveat, though, is that because these records are handwritten records with lots of different handwriting, the transcriptions are not always perfect. So there are mistakes, and sometimes you have to be able to search the census in a different way than just typing in a name, even though obviously that's the first thing you want to try. But that's why it's nice that it's available from different places or different indexing, because one set of eyes may see something different, and actually may get it correct, maybe the second time around. So when the census got released, of course, everybody was very excited because they knew that every time a census gets released, it's a set of records that can really help to solve a mystery. There's some people that you just lose track of them. They just vanish.
Right.
And, again, it could be because that paper trail, like I said, it all depends on which records survive. And so people were very anxiously awaiting this. And they didn't want to wait until the indexing was complete.
Right.
So going back to what we talked about, the telephone books, if you had an exact address of where somebody was in 1940, there is a way to convert that address into what's known as an enumeration district.
Okay.
We abbreviate it to be an ED, ED number.
Okay.
So if you have the ED number, then you could go to the National Archives and you could go to that ED number.
Okay.
Because everything's divided up. It's all,
Right.
there is a manageable way to actually drill down to the pages that you need. And then you would start to browse, because you would still have to browse between 30 and 50 pages.
Right.
You would then start to browse for the name or the address and kind of see if you can find your person that way. And a lot of people were very successful. So in a city, you obviously need an address.
Right.
But if the person lives in a more rural area, maybe it didn't matter that you had an address. You just needed to get the ED.
Okay.
And there's one particular website which is invaluable to doing this kind of research, and it's called One Step. And it's something that it's created by a gentleman out in California, Steve Morris. And actually another gentleman helped him a lot on this particular site, and his name is Joel Weintraub. And the two of them created a tool that converts locations and addresses to enumeration districts. So if you go to there, you could just sort of help. It's a tool that helps you get to where you want to be.
Okay. Interesting.
So now, because it is indexed, we obviously recommend that people start that way. But I always tell people, and this has been true of not just the 1940 census, this is true of any census, if it's not working out, that there may be another way to do this research. That before things were online and people had to come to libraries and archives and look through microfilm, and there was another way of doing this research. And sometimes it's a matter of going back to an earlier way of doing things. And I always say it's like the old-fashioned way of doing things. Because if the new-fangled way is not working out for you, then we try the old-fashioned way, and maybe that will.
It will give you a clue, at least to zero in.
It's worth trying. It's always, especially if you're really stuck, and it's really worth trying everything.
Okay. Well, let me ask you, what else is happening? And you gave us some interesting topics that's happening at the library. Anything else new that's coming up? Feel free to talk about.
Goodness, let's see. Well, because we're the fall season is always a busy time with classes and the lectures, but mainly it's we are still very active in terms of buying new materials for buying new family histories or collecting them, because luckily we get many for gifts as gifts. But I would say, our staff we're very available to people, and you don't have to make an appointment. You can just come in. We're open Monday through Saturday. 10 a.m. is when we open Monday through Saturday. We close most days at 6 o'clock, except on Tuesdays and Wednesdays we stay open until 7:30.
Okay.
Other than that, people can come in. Our room is really lovely. It has a wonderful view of Bryant Park. And we also have Wi-Fi, so if people want to bring their laptops, they can not only access the internet, but more importantly, they can access the library's website with all the databases, so that you can also access Ancestry and many of the other wonderful databases that we use, such as Fold3, Heritage Quest, New American Ancestors, a lot of historic newspapers, because we didn't talk about newspapers, but that is an incredible resource for genealogy. And as more and more of these historic newspapers are getting digitized and searchable, and then that's another great resource. So in the library, we have access to a lot of these things, and like I said, the online stuff is very useful,
right.
Especially when you're trying to find a name. So being able to come in and do that at the library is really nice.
And it's all free. So
free.
why and so you keep adding more and more records from other places.
Well, we don't so much add records ourselves. But these databases that we subscribe to,
okay,
they definitely do. And then going back again to not everything is a subscription database. I mean, there are a lot of really good free resources out there. And I find what the hardest part for most people is that they just don't know which websites or which databases are the best.
Right, right.
And so that's something the library, tries to help people with. We create lists and things like that, and we link to the most important databases and websites. Whether it's something we're paying for, obviously we're going to link to it. But the free stuff we also really heavily promote. I mean, one of my favorite websites is, again, going back to the vital records and how they can be a little tricky to use. But the folks out in Long Island associated with two different genealogical groups. They're the Italian genealogical group and the German genealogical group. And they're a society based out in Long Island. And the folks in Long Island are very interested in New York City records because if you know anything about the history of Long Island, you know that most of the people who live out there originated from New York City. So they're, basically their ancestors were New Yorkers or New York City folk. And then at some point they moved to the suburbs and they moved out to Long Island.
Right.
So they, through the help of volunteers, they transcribed the index to birth, deaths, and marriage records. And they created a website that's completely free. And it's a website I use every day with people in the library because it's such an important resource, and it really helps people find the exact date of their, when their ancestors were born or married or died, and then ultimately will lead them to where they can go to get the record themselves.
Okay.
And Family Search, like we mentioned, familysearch.org is another really important resource, not only for the how-to information that's there, but they in themselves have, a huge database. And what I love about Family Search is that it's very international in scope. So they, their library in Salt Lake City is the biggest collection of genealogical records in the world. And it is an international collection, and they have gone to many places around the planet and have asked and have gotten permission to microfilm records. So for decades, they've been microfilming church records and government records and, any place that they can get access. And then they store it at the library, and they do make it available for free in other ways. But now they're really succeeding in doing that by digitizing these records. And then through the help of volunteers, they're indexing those records.
Okay. Yeah. So let's see. Good records. Now, one thing I don't know is that you do you have online records of I would say online records, passenger list.
Yes.
Do you have?
Well, so passenger lists or manifests is in the U.S. specifically. It's the listing of the people who arrived into the various ports where they were being taken in.
Right.
And the most famous of these is, of course, Ellis Island.
Right.
But, of course, people came to this country and traveled and entered in many other ports throughout the United States. So, people entered through Boston and Philadelphia and Baltimore and New Orleans and Los Angeles, and, the list goes on of different ways that people entered. And for people who their ancestors came to this country, let's say in in the 19th century, 20th century, and immigrated, and because there was so much immigration, especially around 1900 and those years, 10 years before and after. A lot of Americans can trace their ancestry to people coming to this country around that time, because there were just so many millions and millions of people who came at that time.
Right.
And a lot of times, because so much time has passed, it's 100 years later.
Right.
They may not know. They may know that their family came from, let's say somewhere like Russia, or Italy, or Ireland, but they may not know an exact town.
Right.
They might not even know a region. So looking at a passenger manifest might be a way to find out that information that you don't have.
Right.
So exactly where did your ancestor come from? Not just the country, which is what the census gives you,
Right.
but more specifically, you want to know the town. And again, if you're going to continue doing your research, it's going to be very, very important to know the town where your ancestors were born or where they lived, because that's where the records are going to be.
Okay.
And so going back to the very beginning, this idea of the who, where, and when becomes really important, and the more specific you can get, the better your information is going to be.
Right.
They are, and actually primarily through Ancestry is how we access those.
Through Ancestry.
Because
Okay.
they have done the most complete indexing of the passenger lists. And so, they have for New York going back to 1820, but they have it for many, many other ports of entry. So if you're not sure which port somebody entered, sometimes people just assume it was New York, and New York was the biggest point of entry, so a lot of people came, but not everybody did, and sometimes it was cheaper to go through Canada and then come in that way, just crossing the border.
Right.
And sometimes people just entered other ways. But yes, they are searchable like the census. You can search by name, and then you can actually view the record itself, the manifest itself, and see what information is there, so you can see who else they may have traveled with. Hopefully you can find out what town they were born in. You can find out things like where they were going. So when they were coming to this country, they were asked, where are you going next? And oftentimes they were coming to live with a relative, and that in itself can be really useful information.
That's helpful. Yeah. Very good. Very good. Now, we talk about municipal archives. What records do they have there that are not at the public library?
So the public library has access to lots of different kinds of records, but of course there's lots of records that we don't have access to, because some of these records are owned by particular government agencies, and so they're held by those repositories. So the Municipal Archives is the main archive for New York City records. And at a certain point, the more historic records end up there. So a lot of agencies will hold on to their records if they're more current, but oftentimes, at a certain point, they'll send their older records. And at that point, too, is when a lot of those records become available to the public, because many records have restrictions if they're more recent, because of privacy considerations. They're sort of legally mandated that way. But a lot of records will be opened up to the public, and so a place like the Municipal Archives is a place where those records are offered up to the public.
Where is the Municipal Archives?
They're down on Chambers Street.
Oh, the Chamber. Okay.
In the Surrogate Court building. It's that building. It's literally right behind City Hall. And I believe the address is 51 Chambers Street. And if you look up the Municipal Archives New York City, you'll find it. But I mentioned earlier, one of the best records that they have are the earlier historic sort of birth records, death records, marriage records. But they also have other records that can be useful. Like they have some tax records. They have Board of Education records. They actually have something that is not necessarily useful for information per se, but they do have a great collection of photographs that when people start to do this research, they like to have some visuals.
Right, right.
And sometimes you'll have photographs within your family, which is really nice. But to supplement that, sometimes people like to look for photos of where their ancestors lived. So at the New York Public Library, we have a great collection of photographs. And actually a lot of them are viewable online for free in something called the Digital Gallery. The Municipal Archives has also started to digitize some of their photos, but one of their most popular collections is not yet digitized.
Okay.
And it's called the 1940 tax photos. And in 1940, around that time, they embarked on a project to photograph every single building in New York City. And so, obviously, if you're looking for a building that your ancestor lived in New York, you're going to be pretty guaranteed that you're going to find that
picture
from 1940.
That's very important when you're putting together a family tree to show those kind of places where they have lived or the neighborhood back then. It's very interesting.
And if you're creating a website, or if you're going to create a book, or anything that you want to then share with your family, it's really nice to have those visuals and to kind of show the building, the neighborhood where your ancestors lived. I think having that is makes it more compelling. Right.
Very true. Very true. Well, I think we have come to the end of our session. Mara, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.